At my daughter's wedding, my ex-wife announced, "Her real father is here now." She pointed to her new husband. The guests applauded. I stood up and said, "Should I show them the DNA test or the adoption papers you forged?" The crystal champagne flute in my hand was cold, beaded with condensation that dripped onto my thumb, a physical sensation. I focused on to ground myself as the woman who had spent the last 15 years attempting to erase my existence tapped a silver spoon against her glass. It was 6:42 p.m. on Saturday, June 14th, and the setting sun was casting a golden, deceptive glow over the Napa Valley vineyard that Vanessa had selected for our daughter Sarah's wedding. The venue rental fee alone was $45,000, a fact I knew because I had seen the invoice during the discovery phase of our last custody modification hearing. Though Vanessa had insisted Greg, her husband of 5 years, pay for it to maintain the illusion of his paternal dominance. I sat at table 14, deliberately placed near the kitchen entrance, far from the head table where Sarah sat looking radiant but anxious in a Vera Wang gown that cost $12,000. Vanessa stood up. She was wearing a pale gold dress that was arguably too close to white, a classic narcissistic power move to draw focus. She looked impeccable, I will give her that. At 48, she had maintained the icy, preserved beauty that had first captivated me 26 years ago when we were both junior associates at a Chicago architectural firm. But I knew the rot beneath the foundation. I knew the structural instability of the persona she presented to this crowd of 200 guests, mostly comprised of Greg's hedge fund partners and Vanessa's curated social circle. She took the microphone, her smile tight and practiced. "When Sarah was born," she began, her voice trembling with a manufactured emotion that I had seen her rehearse in the mirror 1,000 times. "I didn't know how we would make it. It was a difficult time. This was the first lie. I was there. I was the one who held her hand for 18 hours of labor at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. I was the one who cut the cord at 4:12 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was the one who paid the $3,500 deductible. But in Vanessa's revisionist history, I was a ghost," she continued, turning her gaze toward Greg, a man whose net worth of $20 million was his entire personality. "But then, 5 years ago, our family finally became whole. Greg, you stepped in when no one else would. You loved Sarah not because you had to, but because you chose to." The room went silent. I felt the eyes of my few remaining friends at the table dart toward me, filled with pity. I didn't look back. I was looking at Sarah. She was looking down at her plate, her knuckles white as she gripped her napkin. She knew. She knew this speech was a weapon. "And that is why," Vanessa said, raising her voice for the crescendo, "I want to make a toast to the man who raised her in spirit, if not in name. To Sarah's real father, who is here now." She pointed to Greg. The guests, oblivious to the truth or simply swept up in the expensive theater of it all, began to applaud. A few people cheered. Greg stood up, looking humble and magnanimous, waving his hand as if acknowledging a coronation. The applause grew louder, a wave of social validation that Vanessa drank in like oxygen. It was the inverted outcome I had anticipated. She thought this was her victory lap, the final rewriting of the narrative, where I was the deadbeat and she was the savior who found a better replacement. She didn't know that the black leather briefcase sitting under my chair contained exactly 3 pounds of documents that would turn this vineyard into a crime scene. I stood up. I didn't rush. I buttoned my jacket, a bespoke charcoal suit I had purchased specifically for this moment for $2,800, and picked up the briefcase. I walked toward the head table. The applause faltered, then died out completely as people realized I was approaching the microphone. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolutely perfect. Vanessa's smile froze. Her eyes flicked to the security guards at the perimeter, but they didn't move. I was the father of the bride, an invited guest, and I hadn't done anything violent. Yet, I reached the table. I didn't take the microphone from her. I simply leaned into it, my voice projected clearly over the terrified silence of the vineyard. "That was a beautiful speech, Vanessa," I said, my tone flat, analytical, the voice of a man reviewing a flawed blueprint. "But since we are discussing real fathers and legal definitions, I think we should clarify the record." I placed the briefcase on the table, right next to the 3-tier lemon chiffon cake. The click of the latches opening echoed through the speakers. "Should I show them the DNA test or the adoption papers you forged?" The color drained from her face so instantly it looked like a special effect. Greg stopped waving. Sarah looked up, tears in her eyes, but she didn't stop me. She nodded just once. That nod was my permission. That nod was the result of a conversation we had 3 days ago in a coffee shop where I showed her what her mother had done. To understand why I chose to detonate a nuclear device at my only daughter's wedding, you have to understand the 18 months of procedural warfare that led to this moment. It wasn't about jealousy. It wasn't about Greg. It was about a felony. The story didn't start at the wedding. It started on a rainy Tuesday in November, 18 months prior, when I received a notification from my credit monitoring service. It was a mundane alert, a change in address request filed with the county clerk. I scrutinized it because I am a creature of detail. As a forensic structural engineer, my entire career is built on noticing the hairline fracture before the bridge collapses. The address change wasn't for me. It was for Sarah. She was 22, finishing her master's degree, and still on my insurance. But the address listed wasn't her apartment or my house. It was a P.O. box in a town 3 hours away. I called the county clerk's office. After 45 minutes on hold and a $15 processing fee, I spoke to a clerk named Janice. "I'm looking at a filing for Sarah Elizabeth Miller, Janice said, the typing of her keyboard audible in the background. Yes, it looks like part of the step-parent adoption petition filed last month. The world stopped. I'm sorry, I said, my voice dropping an octave. What adoption petition? The petition for step-parent adoption, Janice repeated, sounding bored. Filed by Gregory Thorne, with consent from the mother, Vanessa Thorne, and the biological father, Robert Miller. The hearing is scheduled for December 12th. I felt a coldness spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. I am Robert Miller, I said, and I never signed a consent form. The silence on the other end was the first brick in the wall of evidence I began to build that day. I drove to the courthouse immediately. I took the afternoon off work, canceling a site inspection for a high-rise downtown. When I got the file, it was thick. I flipped to the consent form. There, at the bottom of page 4, was my signature. It looked like my signature. It had the loop on the R and the sharp cross on the 8, but it wasn't mine. The date next to it was October 14th. On October 14th, I was in London for a conference on seismic retrofitting. I had the flight records. I had the hotel receipt from the Savoy. I had the stamped passport. I stood in the middle of the Hall of Records, surrounded by dust and bureaucracy, and I realized that Vanessa wasn't just trying to alienate me. She was trying to legally exterminate me. She wanted Greg to adopt Sarah so they could change her last name, erase the Miller from her identity, and present a unified Thorne family front for Greg's upcoming profile in Forbes magazine. I didn't call Vanessa. I didn't scream. I went to see Mr. Vance. Arthur Vance is a man I had worked with on a collapsed parking garage case years ago. He was formerly with the FBI's fraud division, specializing in document verification. He operates out of a small, meticulous office that smells of toner and old coffee. I placed the certified copy of the petition on his desk, along with 10 samples of my actual signature from checks and contracts. I need a forensic handwriting analysis, I told him, and I need it admissible in court. Vance looked at the documents under a jeweler's loupe for a long time. The pressure points are wrong, he said after 10 minutes, pointing to the M. See this hesitation mark? The forger paused here to check their reference. It's a tracing, or a high-quality practice run. A good job, but not perfect. I can write a report, Robert. But if you want to bury them, you need more than just the forgery. You need the motive. The motive was clear, the narrative. Vanessa needed me gone to complete her image. But to prove it to the extent that would destroy her credibility forever, I needed to go deeper. I hired Vance on a retainer of $5,000. We started digging. We found that the notary who witnessed my signature was a woman named Linda Kay, who turned out to be the sister of Greg's executive assistant. That was conspiracy to commit fraud. We dug into the adoption filing itself. In the affidavit, Vanessa had claimed that I had abandoned Sarah, stating I had no contact with her for over a year. This was easily disprovable. I had text logs, Venmo receipts for her tuition support, $22,000 that year alone, and photos of us at her graduation 3 months prior. The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. It relied entirely on the assumption that I wouldn't notice the filing until it was too late. But the pièce de résistance was the DNA test. Why did I need a DNA test if I knew I was the father? Because in the petition, Vanessa had included a strange throwaway line to justify the abandonment claim. She hinted that I knew I wasn't the biological father and had withdrawn due to lack of genetic link. It was a backup lie, a safety net in case the abandonment claim was challenged. She was willing to bastardize her own child to win. So, I invited Sarah to lunch. It was the hardest conversation of my life. I sat her down at a quiet bistro and showed her the filing. I showed her the forged signature. She read it, her hands shaking, her face pale. Mom said, "You agreed to this," she whispered. "She said you wanted to move on and focus on your new life." I reached across the table and held her hand. "Sarah, I would never sign away being your father. Being your father is the only job that matters to me." We went to a lab together that afternoon. We swabbed our cheeks. The results came back 4 days later. 99.99998% probability of paternity. We had the trifecta. The forged signature proved fraud. The financial records proved the abandonment claim was perjury. The DNA test proved the biological claim was slander. Sarah wanted to confront them immediately. She wanted to scream at her mother. I stopped her. "If we do it now," I told her, my voice steady, "they will spin it. They will say it was a misunderstanding, a paperwork error. They will gaslight you. We need to do this publicly. We need witnesses." "The wedding," Sarah said, a dark realization dawning in her eyes. "She's making the wedding all about them, about their perfect family." "Exactly," I said. "Let her build the stage. Let her gather the audience, and then we will turn on the lights." So we waited. For 6 months, we played the part. I attended the rehearsal dinner, smiling tightly, while Greg made jokes about taking the baton. I paid the deposit for the florist when Vanessa's credit card was mysteriously maxed out due to a limit issue, $8,500. I let them think they had won. I let the adoption hearing date pass. I had my lawyer file a motion to stay the proceedings under seal, so they didn't know the judge had already paused it pending a fraud investigation. They thought the silence meant the adoption had gone through by default. They thought I was out. Now, standing at the head table, the smell of expensive perfume and fear in the air, I opened the briefcase. I pulled out the first document. It was mounted on a stiff board so it wouldn't flap in the breeze. "Exhibit A," I announced, holding it up for the room to see. A forensic analysis of the consent to adopt form filed in county court on November 14th. According to Mr. Arthur Vance, certified document examiner with 30 years of FBI FBI experience. The probability of this signature being mine is 0. It is a forgery, executed by someone with access to my old checks. I looked at Vanessa. Who has access to my old checks, Vanessa? You kept the financial records from 2010 to 2018, the crowd murmured. The hedge fund managers were leaning in. They understood fraud. They understood documents. Exhibit B, I continued, pulling out a spreadsheet printed on 11x17 paper. The petition claims I abandoned my daughter and provided no financial support for 12 months. This is a notarized ledger of bank transfers from my account to Sarah's for tuition, rent, and living expenses totaling $48,500 in the alleged period of abandonment. I dropped the paper on the cake table. It landed with a heavy thud. Perjury, Vanessa. That's a felony. Up to 4 years in state prison. Vanessa tried to grab the microphone. Security! She shrieked, her voice cracking. Get him out of here! He's drunk! He's ruining the wedding. I haven't had a drop to drink, I said calmly, and I think the guests want to hear the rest. Don't you? I looked at the crowd. No one moved. They were captivated. This was better than the wedding. This was a live execution of a socialite. And finally, I said, reaching for the last document, the one in the red folder, the reason we are all here, the real father speech. I pulled out the DNA test results. In the filing, you claimed I wasn't the biological father to expedite the process without my consent. You swore under oath that you had an affair in 1998 that resulted in Sarah's conception. You tried to legally bastardize our daughter to stroke your husband's ego. I held up the paper. LabCorp case #height 8920B. Probability of paternity 99.99%. I am her father. I have always been her father. And the man sitting next to you, I pointed at Greg, who was now looking at Vanessa with a mixture of horror and calculation, is an accessory to attempted kidnapping by fraud. I turned to Sarah. She stood up. She walked over to me, past her mother, past Greg. She took the microphone from the stand. The silence was absolute. He's telling the truth, Sarah said, her voice clear and strong. I helped him get the evidence because I didn't want a new father. I wanted the one I already had. She looked at her mother. You forged his name, Mom. You tried to sell me to Greg like I was a piece of furniture you were reupholstering. Vanessa looked around the room. She was looking for an ally, for a sympathetic face. But she saw what I saw, the witnesses. The 200 people she had invited to validate her status were now the jury at her inquest. The illusion was shattered. The perfect mother mask lay in pieces on the floor, right next to the $12,000 dress. Greg stood up slowly. He looked at the documents on the table, then at Vanessa. You told me he agreed, Greg said, his voice low but audible. You told me he signed it. You told me the lawyer handled it. He did, Vanessa cried, grabbing his arm. Greg, baby, don't listen to him. He's twisting everything. Greg pulled his arm away. He was a numbers man. He looked at the forensic report. He looked at the bank statements. He knew a bad investment when he saw one. I can't be part of this, he said. My compliance officer, if this is fraud. He backed away. The real father was retreating. I closed the briefcase. The snap of the latches was the final punctuation mark. The police are waiting in the parking lot, I said to Vanessa. Officer Miller, no relation, is expecting you. I filed the charges for forgery, perjury, and fraud this morning. They were gracious enough to wait until the speeches were over. I offered my arm to Sarah. Shall we go? I asked. I believe we have a reception to skip. Sarah took my arm. We walked away from the head table, down the center aisle, past the rows of stunned guests. We didn't look back, but as we reached the exit, I heard the sound I had been waiting for, the wailing of a siren, getting louder, coming up the long, winding driveway of the vineyard. The hook had been set. The discovery was revealed. Now, we were heading into the aftermath. The blue and red strobes of the Napa County Sheriff's cruisers cut through the twilight, turning the rows of manicured grapevines into a surreal, flickering disco of law enforcement. It was 7:04 p.m. when Officer Miller, a man I had spoken with on the phone 3 times but never met, stepped out of his vehicle, adjusting his belt. The gravel crunched under his boots, a sound that seemed louder than the stunned silence of the 200 guests who were still holding their champagne flutes, frozen in a tableau of expensive confusion. Vanessa was still standing at the head table, clutching the tablecloth with a grip so tight her knuckles were white, looking at the approaching officers with a mixture of disbelief and indignation. She expected Greg to intervene, to use his wealth as a shield, but Greg was currently 10 feet away from her, frantically typing on his phone, likely emailing his general counsel to initiate damage control. Vanessa Thorne? Officer Miller asked, his voice carrying over the gentle hum of the jazz band that had awkwardly stopped playing. I have a warrant for your arrest for 3 counts of forgery, 2 counts of perjury, and 1 count of filing a false instrument with a public office. The gasp from the crowd was audible, a collective intake of breath from the social elite watching one of their own being dismantled. Vanessa tried to laugh, a brittle, high-pitched sound. This is ridiculous, she stammered, smoothing the silk of her $5,000 dress. My ex-husband is clearly having a mental breakdown. Greg, tell them this is a misunderstanding. Greg didn't look up. I didn't know, he muttered, loud enough for the officers to hear. She handled the paperwork. I thought it was legal. I'm not involved in this. The betrayal hit Vanessa harder than the handcuffs. Her face crumpled as Officer Miller recited her Miranda rights, turning her around to cuff her hands behind the back of that custom-made gown. The illusion of her invincibility shattered. I watched from the edge of the terrace, Sarah's hand gripping my arm. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I felt the cold, heavy satisfaction of a structural engineer watching a controlled demolition go exactly according to plan. The building was coming down, and it was falling into its own footprint. We didn't stay to watch them put her in the car. That would have been gaudy. Instead, we walked to the parking lot, got into my rental sedan, a practical Ford Taurus that cost $45 a day, and drove out of the vineyard gates just as the second squad car was pulling in. We drove for 20 minutes in silence, the Napa scenery rolling by in the dark. Sarah stared out the window, watching her reflection in the glass. "She's going to jail, isn't she?" she asked quietly, her voice devoid of the trembling that had been there earlier. "Probable cause is high," I replied, keeping my eyes on the winding road. With the forensic report and the notary's testimony which Vance secured yesterday after pointing out that she could lose her license, the district attorney has a slam-dunk case. Penal Code 470 is not something they take lightly when it involves the court system. We stopped at a diner off Highway 29. It was 8:30 p.m. The contrast between the Michelin star menu we had just walked away from and the laminated menu in front of us was stark, but the air in the diner felt cleaner. We ordered burgers and fries. When the food came, Sarah took a bite and closed her eyes. "It's over," she whispered. "I'm not a thorn." "You never were," I said, dipping a fry in ketchup. "You're a Miller, and Miller women don't get erased." The legal fallout was swift, brutal, and expensive. The arraignment took place on Tuesday morning at the County Superior Court. I was there, sitting in the back row, taking notes in a leather-bound journal. Vanessa was brought in wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, a jarring visual shift from the gold silk of Saturday night. Her bail was set at $250,000. Her lawyer, a man named Specialized in White-Collar Defense, argued for release on recognizance, citing her ties to the community. The assistant district attorney, armed with the dossier I had compiled, countered that she was a flight risk given her access to Greg's private aviation resources and the severe nature of the fraud. The judge agreed. "Bail stands," Judge Harrison ruled, "and let the record show that a temporary restraining order is granted for Robert and Sarah Miller." The most interesting development, however, was not criminal, but civil. On Wednesday, 3 days after the arrest, Greg filed for an annulment. Not a divorce, an annulment. He cited fraud in the inducement, claiming that Vanessa had misrepresented her character and legal standing, thereby tricking him into the marriage. It was a ruthless maneuver designed to bypass the community property laws and leave her with absolutely nothing. He didn't want to split his $20 million. He wanted to cut the necrosis out of his life. I read the filing online. It was cold, precise, and entirely lacking in empathy. It was exactly what she deserved. Without Greg's money, Vanessa's defense crumbled. She couldn't afford the $800 an hour firm she had initially retained. She was forced to switch to a mid-tier attorney who looked exhausted before the case even began. The discovery phase revealed the depth of her deception. The notary, Linda Kay, rolled on her immediately in exchange for immunity. In her deposition, Linda admitted that Vanessa had paid her $5,000 cash in an envelope to notarize the forged signature. She even had the text messages to prove it. "Make sure the date matches the flight logs." Vanessa had texted her on October 12th. "He needs to be out of the country on the paper." That single text message was the smoking gun. It proved premeditation. It proved malice. It moved the charge from simple forgery to aggravated identity theft. We didn't have to go to trial. On the morning jury selection was supposed to begin, 6 months after the wedding, Vanessa's lawyer called the DA. She wanted a deal. I was consulted, as the victim, on the terms. She's offering a guilty plea to 1 count of felony forgery and 1 count of perjury. The DA told me over the phone. She wants probation. "No," I said, looking at the architectural plans for a new library I was designing. "She tried to steal my daughter. She tried to rewrite history using the legal system as her pen. I want time. It doesn't have to be a decade, but it has to be real. She needs to sit in a cell and realize that she is not above the laws of physics or the state." We settled on 18 months in state prison, followed by 3 years of parole and restitution of $48,000 to cover my legal fees and the cost of the investigation. The sentencing hearing was the final act of the play she had written for herself. I gave a victim impact statement. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I stood at the podium and looked at her. She looked older. The Botox had worn off, the hair was uncolored, and the malice was replaced by a dull, gray fear. "Your Honor," I said, "the defendant didn't just forge a signature. She attempted to forge a reality. She believed that her desire for a certain social image outweighed my right to be a father and my daughter's right to her lineage. She treated the court not as an arbiter of truth, but as a tool for her vanity. A prison sentence is not just punishment. It is a necessary pause. It is the only way to stop the momentum of her narcissism." The judge sentenced her to the full 18 months. When the gavel banged, Vanessa didn't look at me. She looked at the door, hoping, perhaps until the very last second, that Greg would burst in and save her. He never came. He was likely on his yacht in the Mediterranean, already dating a 26-year-old model who didn't come with baggage or felonies. The aftermath was a slow reconfiguration of gravity. Sarah finished her master's degree in urban planning 3 months later. I sat in the front row, cheering louder than anyone when they called Sarah Elizabeth Miller. She didn't change her name. She wore it like a shield. We spent the next few years rebuilding the time we had lost to Vanessa's games. We went on trips, real trips, not photo ops. We hiked the Inca Trail in Peru. We took a cooking class in Bologna. We talked about the years of manipulation, the gaslighting, the subtle ways Vanessa had tried to make Sarah feel guilty for loving me. She used to tell me you didn't pay child support. Sarah told me one night over wine in Rome. She said you spent it all on your bachelor lifestyle. I laughed, a genuine, hearty laugh. My bachelor lifestyle was a one-bedroom apartment near the office so I could save for your tuition fund, I said. I have the spreadsheets if you want to see them. I don't need the spreadsheets, Dad, she smiled. I have the truth. That was the victory, not the prison sentence, though that was satisfying. The victory was the restoration of the factual record. 5 years have passed since the wedding that wasn't. I am 53 now. My hair is grayer, but my stride is lighter. I sold the big house in the suburbs, too many ghosts, and bought a loft in the city, closer to my firm. I'm dating a woman named Elena, a restoration artist who works on historical paintings. She understands the value of preserving the original layer, of removing the varnish to see what's underneath. She knows about Vanessa. She knows about the briefcase. She doesn't find it scary. She finds it competent. You protect what matters, she told me once. That's a rare quality. Vanessa was released after serving 14 months on good behavior. She lives in a small apartment in Sacramento now. I know this because I have a Google alert set for her name, not out of obsession, but out of diligence. She works in retail, I believe. The felony conviction keeps her out of the corporate world, and the social pariah status keeps her out of the fundraising galas. She tries to reach out to Sarah occasionally. Emails, mostly. I miss you. I did it for us. The usual refrains of the unrepentant. Sarah forwards them to a folder she calls the archive and never replies. We don't hate her anymore. Hate requires energy. We have achieved something far more powerful: indifference. We view her as a structural failure that was identified, isolated, and bypassed. Last weekend, Sarah got married. For real this time. It wasn't at a vineyard. It was at a botanical garden in the city. A small, intimate affair with 50 close friends and family. The groom is a structural engineer she met at work, a detail I find endlessly amusing. There were no speeches about real fathers. There were no theatrics. There was just a ceremony, simple and honest. When it was time to walk her down the aisle, the music started a string quartet playing a Beatles song. I stood there, offering my arm. Sarah looked at me, her eyes bright. "Ready, Dad?" she asked. "Ready," I said. We walked down the aisle together, my arm linking hers, a physical connection that no forged paper could ever sever. I looked out at the crowd. I saw my friends. I saw Elena smiling. I saw the absence of drama. It was the most boring wedding I had ever attended, and it was absolutely perfect. The champagne tasted like grapes, not victory. The air smelled like jasmine, not fear. As we reached the altar and I placed her hand in the groom's, I took a step back. I didn't need to be the center of attention. I didn't need a microphone. I just needed to be there, standing in my assigned spot, bearing the load, holding the space. I sat down in the front row, adjusted my cufflinks, and took a deep breath. The ledger was balanced. The project was complete. And for the first time in 20 years, I closed the file.